Welcome to the history of Atlantis. Did you ever imagine how life in Atlantis could have looked like before the island was said to disappear beneath the sea? In this video, ancient descriptions and historical comparison are used to carefully reconstruct what daily life in the lost civilization may have been like. If Atlantis existed as described by ancient sources, then it was not a place defined only by its destruction. Long before earthquakes and floods, it would have been a living society, shaped by geography, routine, belief, and the quiet repetition of daily life. Plato describes Atlantis first, not as a mystery, but as a functioning civilization. An island with fertile land, abundant resources, and a population capable of sustaining order across generations. If these descriptions reflect a real society, then life in Atlantis would have unfolded within a landscape designed as much by human planning as by nature itself. The island was said to be rich in plains, surrounded by mountains, and nourished by water. This suggests that much of daily life would have revolved around agriculture. Farming would not have been a marginal activity, but the foundation of stability. Fields would have been organized, irrigated, and worked seasonally, producing grains, fruits, and other crops capable of supporting a large population. In such a society, the rhythm of life would have followed the land. Mornings beginning with labor in the fields, tending to irrigation channels, maintaining soil, harvesting according to the seasons. This was not subsistence farming in the fragile sense, but organized production, likely overseen by local authorities to ensure consistency and fairness. Plato emphasizes abundance. This implies surplus, and surplus changes how people live. When food is reliable, societies can specialize. Not everyone needs to farm. Some become builders, administrators, craftsmen, or traders. Daily life becomes layered rather than uniform. Atlantis, if reconstructed from this perspective, would have been a place where daily roles were clearly defined. People likely understood where they belonged within the broader structure of society. Stability depends on predictability, and predictability depends on order. The presence of canals suggests advanced water management. Water would not have been chaotic or uncontrolled. It would have been guided, divided, and regulated. This implies planning, cooperation, and maintenance. Entire segments of the population may have been responsible for ensuring the canals remained functional, clean, and navigable. Movement through Atlantean cities would have been shaped by this infrastructure. People crossing bridges, walking along quays, loading goods onto boats. Water would have been a constant presence, both practical and symbolic. It connected districts, enabled trade, and reinforced the idea that the city itself was engineered. Housing, while not described in detail, can be cautiously inferred. In a planned society with access to stone and metals, dwellings would likely have been permanent, structured, and relatively uniform. Not luxurious for most, but solid. Homes designed for families, storage, and protection from weather rather than display. Social life would have unfolded in shared spaces. Markets, gathering areas, religious precincts. A society capable of monumental construction would also require communal interaction. Trade of goods, exchange of information, and reinforcement of social norms would occur in public, not in isolation. Plato describes Atlantis as ruled by kings, but bound by law. This distinction matters. Power was not arbitrary. Laws existed to limit excess and ensure continuity. This suggests that ordinary people may have experienced life as stable rather than oppressive, at least during the civilization's earlier phases. Governance would have shaped daily expectations. Taxes or tributes likely existed, possibly in the form of agricultural surplus rather than currency. Obligations to the state would have been part of life, but balanced by protection, infrastructure, and order. Religion, though sparsely described, would have been central. Poseidon is presented not merely as a god, but as an ancestor. This implies that political authority and religious belief were intertwined. Rituals may have reinforced loyalty, hierarchy, and moral order. Daily religious practice may not have been dramatic. It would have been routine, offerings, observances, seasonal ceremonies tied to agriculture and water. Religion in stable societies tends to emphasize continuity rather than crisis. Children in Atlantis would have grown up within this structured environment. Education, though informal by modern standards, would have focused on role preparation, learning farming techniques, craftsmanship, or administration through observation and repetition. Time would have been experienced differently. Without mechanical clocks, life would follow daylight, seasons, and ritual calendars. The sense of urgency modern societies feel would have been absent. Life moved slower, but not aimlessly. Plato emphasizes that Atlantis was initially virtuous. This suggests a cultural emphasis on restraint, cooperation, and balance. Daily behavior would have been shaped by expectation rather than enforcement. Social pressure often regulates behavior more effectively than law. Trade likely extended beyond the island. Plato describes Atlantean influence across regions. This implies seafaring, navigation, and exchange. Merchants and sailors would have been a distinct part of society, connecting Atlantis to other cultures. For ordinary people, this meant exposure to foreign goods, ideas, and stories. Atlantis would not have felt isolated. It would have felt connected, confident, and secure in its place within the world. This sense of security is important. Societies rarely collapse when people feel uncertain. They collapse when people feel invincible. Life in Atlantis, during its height, may have felt predictable, prosperous, and permanent. Children growing into adulthood without knowing hardship. Generations believing the system would continue because it always had. This is where reconstruction becomes meaningful. Plato's Atlantis does not fall because people were starving or desperate. It falls because they lost restraint. Excess replaces balance. Expansion replaces harmony. The very systems that created stability begin to strain under ambition. But that comes later. In its earlier phase, Atlantis would have been experienced simply as home, a place where daily life unfolded without awareness of its eventual fate. People waking, working, eating, worshipping, resting. Lives lived without knowing they would become a lesson. Atlantis, in this reconstruction, is not mysterious to those who lived there. It is ordinary, functional, alive, and it is precisely this ordinariness that makes its disappearance so unsettling. In the next part, the reconstruction moves deeper, into the city itself. The layout, the concentric design, the symbolic meaning of space, and how architecture may have shaped not only movement, but thought. If daily life in Atlantis unfolded across fields, homes, and canals, then the city itself was the stage upon which that life moved. Plato's description of the Atlantean capital is one of the most detailed elements of the entire account, suggesting that the physical layout of the city was central to how the society understood itself. The capital of Atlantis was said to be built in concentric rings of land and water, arranged around a central high point. This design was not accidental. Circular planning appears in many ancient cultures as a symbol of order, balance, and continuity. If the Atlanteans adopted such a design, then daily movement through the city would have reinforced a sense of structure and harmony. Life within the city would have been defined by water. Canals separated districts, carried goods, and regulated movement. The sound of flowing water would have been constant. Boats, rather than carts, may have served as the primary means of transporting heavy materials through the inner city. This would have made the city feel quieter, slower, and more fluid than land-based settlements. Bridges connected the rings, creating controlled points of access. Movement was guided, not chaotic. People crossing from one district to another would have done so intentionally, aware of boundaries and transitions. This kind of spatial organization shapes behavior. It encourages order, awareness, and predictability. Buildings near the central rings were likely administrative or ceremonial. Plato describes temples, palaces, and official structures positioned with deliberate symmetry. These spaces would not have been part of ordinary daily life for most people, but their presence would have been felt constantly. Authority was visible, not hidden. For artisans and craftsmen, the city offered both opportunity and regulation. Specialized trades require proximity to materials, to markets, to oversight. Workshops may have lined certain canals or districts, producing tools, textiles, vessels, and architectural components. The repetition of skilled labor would have been a defining feature of urban life. Sound within the city would have been layered, water moving through channels, voices in markets, the rhythmic impact of tools against stone or metal. Unlike modern cities, there would have been no mechanical noise, no engines. The dominant sounds would have been human and natural. Trade would have shaped daily interactions. Plato suggests that Atlantis engaged in extensive exchange, both internally and externally. Within the city, goods would move steadily from producers to consumers. Markets would not have been frantic, but orderly, reflecting the regulated nature of society. For those involved in governance, daily life would have been shaped by ritual and responsibility. Kings and officials were bound by law, not absolute power. Plato describes periodic gatherings where rulers reaffirmed their commitment to shared rules. These ceremonies reinforced unity and restrained ambition. Such rituals would have filtered down into daily life. Ordinary people would have been aware that leadership was structured and limited. This awareness contributes to social trust, even in hierarchical societies. Religion would have been inseparable from the city's design. Temples were not hidden away, but integrated into the urban landscape. Poseidon, as both god and ancestor, represented continuity between divine order and human authority. Religious observance likely emphasized gratitude for abundance and respect for balance. Daily religious practice would not have been dramatic. It would have been habitual. Small offerings, quiet prayers, seasonal festivals. The repetition of rituals stabilizes societies. It creates shared meaning without constant emotional intensity. Children growing up in the city would have internalized its structure early. They would learn roots, boundaries, and expectations through daily movement. Education would have been practical, based on imitation rather than instruction. Skills passed from parent to child, master to apprentice. Time in Atlantis would have been experienced through cycles rather than schedules. Water levels, planting seasons, ritual calendars. The city itself, with its circular design, reinforced the idea that life moved in patterns rather than lines. The presence of walls and controlled entrances suggests awareness of security. While Atlantis is described as powerful, power does not eliminate caution. Gates, bridges, and canals served both practical and defensive purposes. Daily life would include awareness of these systems without constant fear. At night, the city would have changed. Without artificial lighting beyond fire and oil lamps, darkness would return quickly. Reflections of lanterns on water, quiet movement along canals, the slowing of activity. Night reinforces reflection. It limits excess. It encourages rest. This rhythm, structured days, calm nights, would have defined the experience of life in Atlantis during its stable period. A society confident enough to plan, but restrained enough to rest. Yet beneath this stability lay potential tension. The same infrastructure that created order also enabled control. The same abundance that allowed specialization also allowed inequality. Plato suggests that over time, the Atlanteans lost their original restraint. Daily life would not change all at once. Excess enters quietly. More ornament, larger buildings, greater displays of wealth, subtle shifts in expectation. What was once sufficient becomes inadequate. But in this reconstruction, that transformation has not yet fully occurred. Life in Atlantis, as imagined here, remains balanced, organized, predictable, comfortable. People do not sense an ending. They live within systems they trust. They assume continuity. And it is precisely this assumption that gives the story its power. In the next part, the reconstruction moves outward, from the city to the wider island. The plains, the mountains, the ports, and the networks that connected Atlantis to the world beyond its shores. Beyond the city, life in Atlantis would have been shaped by the wider island itself. Plato describes an environment that was not only fertile, but carefully organized, suggesting that the relationship between people and land was deliberate rather than accidental. The Great Plain of Atlantis is described as broad and flat, bordered by mountains that protected it from harsh winds. If this description reflects a real landscape, then the plain would have been the agricultural heart of the civilization. Daily life for many Atlanteans would have unfolded here, far from the canals and temples of the capital, but no less essential to its survival. Farming on this scale requires coordination. Fields must be divided, irrigation managed, and harvests stored and distributed. This implies systems of measurement, planning, and oversight. Life in the countryside would not have been isolated or independent. It would have been integrated into a wider network of obligation and exchange. Farmers would rise with the light, following routines shaped by season and weather. Work would be physical, repetitive, and communal. Tools made of stone or early metal would be repaired and reused. Knowledge of soil, water, and timing would be passed down quietly through generations. The presence of canals extending beyond the city suggests that water management reached into the countryside as well. Channels may have carried water to fields, preventing drought and supporting predictable yields. This would have reduced uncertainty, allowing communities to plan rather than react. Villages scattered across the plain would likely have been modest, permanent, but practical. Homes built for durability rather than display. Daily life here would have felt slower than in the city, but also more connected to the rhythms of nature. Children growing up in these areas would learn responsibility early, helping with planting, tending animals, maintaining channels. Education would be experiential, grounded in repetition and observation. There would be little separation between work and life. Beyond the plain, the mountains served a different role. Plato describes them as forested and rich in resources. Wood for construction and fuel would come from these regions, stone for building, perhaps metals mined from veins exposed by erosion. Life in the mountains would have been quieter and more isolated. Those who lived or worked there may have been specialists, woodcutters, miners, guardians of resources. Their connection to the capital would be practical rather than cultural. They supplied what the city needed, but did not shape its identity. The ports of Atlantis formed another vital layer of life. Plato suggests that the island maintained harbors capable of supporting extensive maritime activity. Ships would arrive and depart regularly, carrying goods, people, and information. For sailors and traders, Daily life was uncertain and mobile. Time measured by weather and tides rather than routine. Their experiences would differ sharply from those inland. Exposure to distant cultures, unfamiliar customs, and new ideas would have been common. These travelers served as the connective tissue between Atlantis and the wider world. Through them, the island would learn of events beyond its shores. Through them, influence would spread outward. Trade changes societies subtly. It introduces comparison. When people see how others live, they begin to reassess their own norms. This process is slow, but powerful. Plato suggests that Atlantis extended its influence across regions, implying political ambition. For ordinary people, this expansion may have been distant and abstract at first. More ships, more goods, more construction, prosperity increasing. But expansion also brings pressure. More resources needed, more labor demanded, more coordination required. Life becomes slightly less balanced, slightly more driven. Yet in the reconstruction of daily life, these shifts are gradual. People do not feel history changing. They feel opportunity. The island's geography would have reinforced a sense of protection. Surrounded by sea, sheltered by mountains, Atlantis may have felt secure. This sense of safety encourages confidence. Confidence, over time, can become complacency. Religious observance across the island would have unified these diverse regions. Festivals tied to seasons, harvests, and water cycles would bring people together. Shared rituals reinforce shared identity, even across distance. Music, storytelling, and communal gatherings likely played a role in maintaining cohesion. Oral tradition remains the primary means of preserving values. Stories of ancestors, gods, and past events would be repeated not for accuracy, but for meaning. In this way, Atlantis becomes not just a city, but a culture. One that stretches from canal to field, from harbor to mountain, bound together by infrastructure, belief, and routine. Life across the island would have felt stable, predictable, and meaningful. People understood their roles. They trusted the systems that supported them. They assumed continuity. This assumption is crucial. Civilizations rarely recognize their vulnerability when life feels orderly. Daily routines create the illusion of permanence. The land provides, the water flows, the city stands. In this reconstructed Atlantis, people live without awareness of the future. They do not sense catastrophe approaching. They experience only the present, shaped by work, belief, and rest. And this is what makes the story resonate. Atlantis does not disappear because its people were ignorant or reckless from the beginning. It disappears because they lived long enough to believe their world was unchanging. In the next part, the reconstruction turns inward, toward belief, morality, and the subtle shifts that transform stable societies long before collapse becomes visible. As life in Atlantis unfolded across fields, cities, and harbors, it was shaped not only by geography and labor, but by belief. Belief does not announce itself loudly in stable societies. It settles quietly into routine, shaping behavior without constant reflection. Plato describes Atlantis as a civilization that was not always corrupted. In its early generations, it was guided by moderation, order, and respect for law. If this reflects lived reality, then belief in Atlantis would have emphasized balance rather than fear, continuity rather than crisis. Religion would not have been distant from daily life. It would have been embedded within it. Poseidon, as both god and ancestor, represented legitimacy. Authority flowed from divine origin, but was expected to act within limits. This created a moral framework where power was justified, but not absolute. Daily religious observance would likely have been understated. Quiet rituals performed at home, small offerings at local shrines, seasonal ceremonies tied to water and harvest. These acts reinforced gratitude rather than desperation. A society that feels secure does not pray for survival. It prays for continuity. Moral expectations would have been enforced less through punishment and more through custom. People behave according to what is normal, not what is threatened. In early Atlantis, restraint would have been valued because it worked. Excess was unnecessary when abundance was already present. Children growing up in this environment would learn values through imitation, respect for hierarchy, cooperation within community, acceptance of one's role. Morality would not be debated, it would be absorbed. But belief systems are not static. They respond to success. As Atlantis prospered, confidence would increase, infrastructure expanded, trade intensified, influence spread. With success comes a subtle shift in belief, from gratitude to entitlement. This shift does not feel like corruption when it begins. It feels like progress. Religious rituals may become more elaborate. Temples grow larger. Ceremonies become displays. Offerings increase in scale, not sincerity. What was once symbolic becomes performative. Moral language remains the same, but its meaning changes. Restraint is praised, but no longer practiced. Balance is spoken of, but not enforced. Daily life reflects this change quietly. More ornament in architecture, more differentiation in clothing, greater emphasis on status. These shifts are gradual, almost invisible to those living through them. Plato suggests that the divine element within the Atlanteans weakened over time. Interpreted literally, this refers to the dilution of Poseidon's lineage. Interpreted symbolically, it refers to loss of moral clarity. People begin to justify behavior that would once have felt inappropriate. Expansion becomes ambition rather than cooperation. Wealth becomes identity rather than resource. Belief adapts to support behavior. This is how stable societies change. Not through revolution, but through normalization. Daily routines continue. Markets open. Fields are worked. Rituals performed. Nothing appears broken. Yet the underlying assumptions shift. Life in Atlantis during this phase would still feel comfortable. Perhaps even more so. Abundance allows indulgence. Success reduces caution. People trust systems because they have always worked. Authority responds accordingly. Laws may be interpreted more flexibly. Exceptions become precedents. Power concentrates slightly more at the center. Ordinary people may notice change, but not danger. They see improvement, opportunity, pride. Plato's Atlantis does not fall because people abandon belief. It falls because belief becomes hollow. Ritual without meaning loses its stabilizing power. Law without restraint becomes control. Wealth without humility becomes imbalance. From the perspective of daily life, this transformation would feel slow and subtle. There would be no clear moment when Atlantis felt doomed. Only a gradual distancing from its original values. People still wake, work, eat, rest. Children still grow. Elders still teach. The city still stands. This is the most unsettling aspect of the Atlantis story. Collapse does not begin with disaster. It begins with comfort. By the time excess becomes visible, it has already become familiar. By the time imbalance is recognized, it is already embedded. In this reconstruction, Atlantis at this stage feels confident, not anxious. People believe in their civilization not because they question it, but because they no longer feel the need to. Belief, once a guide, becomes a justification. This prepares the ground for what follows. In the next part, the reconstruction moves toward expansion and overreach. How power extends beyond the island. How ambition reshapes daily expectations. and how the world outside Atlantis begins to matter more than the balance within it. As Atlantis entered a period of sustained prosperity, daily life on the island began to change in ways that were not immediately recognized as dangerous. Stability has a particular effect on societies. When systems function reliably for long periods of time, attention slowly shifts away from preservation and toward expansion. For the people of Atlantis, this shift would not have felt like ambition. It would have felt like confidence. Harbors grew busier. Ships arrived more frequently, their hulls heavy with goods from distant regions. Timber, metals, textiles, and unfamiliar objects passed through the docks and into the city. Markets expanded to accommodate new materials and tastes. What had once been rare became ordinary. For those living near the coast, daily life grew more active. Mornings began earlier. Workdays stretched longer. The rhythm of the harbor became constant, ropes creaking, water lapping against stone, voices calling across the docks. Movement replaced stillness. Trade reshapes perception. When goods flow steadily, scarcity fades from memory. People begin to assume abundance rather than plan for uncertainty. Atlantis, during this phase, would have felt increasingly secure in its ability to sustain itself. The sea became central not only to commerce, but to identity. Sailors and merchants gained status. Navigation knowledge became valuable. Families tied to maritime trade experienced a different life than those rooted in fields and workshops. Time was no longer measured only by seasons, but by voyages and returns. With increased trade came increased administration. Goods needed to be recorded, stored, protected, and redistributed. Oversight expanded quietly. More officials, more procedures, more structure. At first, this structure felt helpful. Order prevents conflict. Regulation ensures fairness. In a growing society, coordination is necessary, but coordination requires authority. As Atlantis extended its influence beyond its shores, political decisions began to affect regions and people who had never seen the capital. This distance changes the nature of governance. Decisions become abstract. Consequences become delayed. For most people, these changes remained subtle. Life still functioned. Food arrived. Water flowed. Laws were enforced. Nothing appeared unstable. Yet beneath the surface, pressure increased. Expansion requires resources. Ships need timber. Harbors need stone. Trade routes need protection. Demand grows faster than supply. Rural areas feel this first. Forests are worked more intensively. Mines dig deeper. Fields are asked to produce more consistently. Daily labor becomes heavier, though still manageable. People adapt. They always do. Adaptation creates the illusion that systems can absorb infinite strain. Religion evolves again to support this new reality. Poseidon, long associated with balance and origin, becomes increasingly associated with power and reach. The sea is no longer only a source of life. It becomes a path to influence. Ritual language reflects this shift. Strength is praised, expansion is framed as destiny, control is presented as protection. These ideas filter into daily life. Stories told to children emphasize achievement. Success abroad becomes a point of pride. Atlantis is no longer simply a place where people live. It is a civilization with purpose. Purpose is intoxicating. As generations pass, restraint begins to feel unnecessary. Why limit growth when growth has brought prosperity? Why question ambition when ambition has worked? In daily life, this appears as subtle excess. Homes grow larger, public buildings more elaborate. Displays of wealth become more common. Not everywhere and not all at once, but enough to change expectations. People compare themselves more often. Status becomes visible. Difference becomes meaningful. This is not decay. It is transformation. Markets reflect it first. Goods once valued for utility are now valued for rarity. Ornament replaces simplicity. Choice expands, but satisfaction narrows. Social relationships shift accordingly. Those closer to trade and power feel elevated. Those farther away feel pressure, though not yet resentment. Order still holds. The systems of Atlantis continue to function. That is the problem. Because they function, no one questions their direction. Administration becomes more centralized. Decision-making narrows. Laws are interpreted with greater flexibility when convenient. Exceptions accumulate, each one justified. Daily life becomes more regulated. Schedules tighten, obligations increase. People comply because compliance has always worked. Civilizations do not collapse when people resist authority. They collapse when authority becomes normal. In this reconstruction, Atlantis at this stage feels impressive, energetic, and purposeful. Visitors would see wealth, order, and confidence. Citizens would feel pride, not fear. The island appears stronger than ever. Yet the balance that once defined Atlantis has shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but decisively. Life continues uninterrupted. Children grow up knowing only this version of Atlantis. To them, this is normal. This is how the world works. Memory of earlier restraint fades. Values remain in language, but not in urgency. The past becomes symbolic rather than instructive. This is how civilizations lose their ability to correct themselves. Atlantis does not yet feel fragile. It feels successful. And success, when unexamined, is the most dangerous condition a society can experience. In the next part, the reconstruction moves closer to the edge, examining how control replaces cooperation, how tension emerges quietly within daily life, and how systems built for balance begin to narrow rather than support the world they once sustained. As Atlantis continued to expand its reach, daily life on the island entered a phase that felt orderly on the surface, but increasingly constrained beneath it. The systems that once existed to support balance now worked primarily to preserve momentum. Growth had become a condition that needed constant maintenance. For ordinary people, this shift was not immediately alarming. The city still functioned. Fields were cultivated. Water flowed through canals. Markets opened each morning and closed each night. Stability, after all, is not measured by freedom, but by predictability. Yet predictability began to narrow. Rules multiplied quietly, not in the form of harsh decrees, but through procedure, permits, approvals, assigned roles. Where earlier generations relied on custom and trust, later ones relied on systems. Systems reduce uncertainty, but they also reduce flexibility. Daily routines became more fixed. Work expectations increased. Schedules tightened. Obligations became less negotiable. People complied not because they feared punishment, but because compliance had always been rewarded. Control does not announce itself as oppression. It presents itself as efficiency. Administration grew more centralized. Decisions affecting distant regions were now made far from those regions. This distance softened accountability. Outcomes were evaluated by numbers rather than experience. Production targets mattered more than local conditions. For farmers, this meant pressure to meet expectations regardless of season or soil. For craftsmen, it meant standardized output rather than personal judgment. For traders, it meant adherence to routes and quotas rather than opportunity. Life became structured around performance. Religion, once a stabilizing force rooted in balance, adapted again. Rituals continued, but their emphasis shifted further toward preservation of order. Ceremonies highlighted unity, obedience, and collective destiny. The divine was invoked not to remind people of limits, but to reinforce direction. Poseidon's role, symbolically, became more distant. Less ancestor, more authority. Less reminder of origin, more justification for reach. In daily life, this translated into subtle moral adjustment. People learned which behaviors were praised and which were quietly discouraged. Public conformity became more important than private belief. Children growing up in this phase absorbed these expectations naturally. They learned discipline early, not through punishment, but through normalization. Order was presented as virtue. Questioning felt unnecessary. Education, informal though it remained, emphasized function over reflection. Skills were taught efficiently. Roles were reinforced. Curiosity was not discouraged, but it was redirected. This produced a population that was capable, productive, and loyal, but less adaptable. Adaptability is rarely valued in stable systems. It becomes valuable only when systems fail. Within the city, architecture reflected these changes. Public spaces grew more monumental. Buildings emphasized permanence and authority. Movement through the city became more guided, less spontaneous. The layout still appeared harmonious, but it now directed behavior more deliberately. People adjusted without resistance. They always do. The countryside felt these changes differently. Increased demand placed continuous strain on land and labor. Productivity remained high, but margins narrowed. The natural variability of environment conflicted with the fixed expectations of administration. When tension emerged, it was managed rather than addressed. Adjustments were made at the edges. Work extended slightly, rest shortened slightly. These changes felt manageable individually. Collectively, they altered the experience of life. Social distance increased. Those closer to administrative centers experienced stability. Those farther away experienced pressure. Communication moved upward, not outward. Feedback became filtered. Yet resentment did not immediately appear. Atlantis was still prosperous, still powerful, still admired. This admiration reinforced belief in the system. External recognition strengthens internal confidence. Success abroad muted discomfort at home. Life continued. People still celebrated festivals, still gathered in markets, still shared meals and stories. But conversation subtly shifted. Topics of expansion, protection, and obligation became more common. Balance was spoken of less frequently. The memory of earlier restraint faded further into abstraction. What made Atlantis resilient in its early phase, flexibility, moderation, humility, was no longer practiced daily. It survived only as tradition, not as habit. And habits, not values, sustain societies. From the perspective of those living within Atlantis, nothing felt urgent. There were no signs of imminent collapse, only the sense that life required more effort than it once had. This is the most deceptive phase of any civilization. When systems still function, when prosperity remains visible, when authority feels legitimate, warning signs are interpreted as noise. Adjustment replaces reflection. Momentum replaces choice. Atlantis, in this reconstruction, has not yet reached disaster. It has reached rigidity. The society has become very good at doing what it already does, and less capable of doing anything else. In the next part, this rigidity encounters its limits. The reconstruction will move toward stress, response, and the narrowing of options as Atlantis approaches a point where adaptation becomes difficult and consequence becomes unavoidable. By the time Atlantis reached this stage of its history, daily life had become deeply structured, deeply familiar, and quietly constrained. The civilization still appeared powerful to those who looked from afar and stable to those who lived within it, but its ability to change had begun to narrow. This narrowing did not feel like danger. It felt like routine. For most people, daily life continued without interruption. They woke at familiar hours. They worked within systems they understood. They followed expectations that had become second nature. Stability, even when restrictive, is comforting when it is predictable. The canals still carried water. The fields still produced food. Ships still arrived and departed. The city still stood. This continuity masked a deeper shift. Atlantis had become dependent on the very systems that once served it. Infrastructure no longer supported life. Life now existed to support infrastructure. Maintenance became constant. Canals required regular dredging. Harbors required reinforcement. Storage facilities expanded. Administrative oversight increased to ensure nothing failed. What had once been remarkable engineering became a burden that could never be allowed to rest. For workers, this meant fewer pauses, more responsibility, less margin for error. Tasks were no longer seasonal in their intensity. They were continuous. Rest still existed, but it was increasingly regulated. Festivals were scheduled. Rituals were organized. Time away from labor was allowed, but defined. Spontaneity faded. People adjusted without protest. Adjustment had always been rewarded. Children born during this period inherited a world already heavy with expectation. They did not remember a time of greater flexibility. To them, Atlantis had always been this way: organized, demanding, efficient. Education, still practical and informal, reinforced this worldview. Skills were taught early, roles assigned quickly. The emphasis was on contribution rather than exploration. Curiosity was not forbidden, but it was redirected toward usefulness. Knowledge that did not serve the system was quietly deprioritized. This produced a society that was exceptionally capable at sustaining itself, but increasingly poor at imagining alternatives. Imagination, like flexibility, weakens when it is not exercised. Belief continued to function as reinforcement rather than guidance. Religious rituals remained frequent, but their emotional depth softened. Repetition replaced reflection. Ceremony replaced meaning. People still believed in divine order, but that belief now supported existing structures rather than questioning them. The gods did not challenge direction, they affirmed it. Poseidon's presence, once symbolic of balance between land and sea, became abstract. The god was honored, but no longer consulted in the deeper sense. Authority invoked the divine, but did not listen for restraint. In daily life, this shift appeared as certainty. Leaders spoke confidently. Decisions were framed as necessary. Alternatives were not explored, because necessity leaves no room for choice. This certainty filtered downward. Ordinary people learned to trust outcomes rather than question processes. When decisions worked, they were accepted. When they caused strain, they were endured. The system, after all, had always recovered. Recovery became expected. But systems that always recover eventually rely on recovery itself as proof of invulnerability. This is a dangerous illusion. As Atlantis continued to exert influence beyond its shores, its external commitments grew heavier. Trade routes had to be protected. Allies supported. Rivals monitored. These responsibilities consumed attention and resources. For those at the center of power, daily life became abstracted from the physical world. Decisions were made in rooms far from fields and docks. Information arrived filtered and summarized. Complexity was reduced to numbers and reports. Distance erodes empathy. Those at the edges of the island felt this first. Rural communities experienced increasing pressure without corresponding voice. Expectations rose, but feedback traveled slowly, if at all. Yet resistance did not emerge. Not yet. The culture of Atlantis valued order. Disorder was associated with weakness. To resist was to disrupt harmony. People internalized this belief deeply. Harmony, however, had begun to mean obedience rather than balance. Social bonds adapted accordingly. Conversations became cautious. Criticism softened into suggestion, then into silence. People learned which topics were safe and which were not worth raising. This silence was not imposed. It was learned. Markets still thrived, but their character changed. Goods circulated efficiently, but variety narrowed. Standardization replaced experimentation. Reliability was valued over innovation. Architecture reflected this mindset. Buildings emphasized durability and authority. Ornamentation served status rather than expression. Public spaces felt grand, but less intimate. Life in Atlantis had become impressive, but less warm. This emotional cooling matters. Societies that lose warmth often mistake discipline for strength and uniformity for unity. Daily life remained functional, but increasingly exhausting. The pace of expectation outpaced the pace of recovery. Small failures required immediate correction. There was little room for error, and even less for rest. Yet people endured. Endurance became a virtue. Endurance, however, is not the same as resilience. Resilience allows adaptation. Endurance absorbs pressure until something breaks. Atlantis had begun to rely on endurance. From the inside, the civilization felt heavy, but stable. From the outside, it appeared dominant and secure. Neither perspective captured the underlying fragility, because fragility does not announce itself with weakness. It announces itself with rigidity. Atlantis had become very good at sustaining the present, and very poor at imagining the future. Change, when it came, would not arrive as adjustment. It would arrive as shock. But those living within Atlantis could not see this. Their lives were filled with routine, obligation, and the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today. This assumption is the final comfort before consequence. In the next and final part, the reconstruction will not dramatize destruction, but reflect on its inevitability. How a society built on balance slowly lost it. How daily life drifted away from adaptability, and how the end of Atlantis, whatever its historical reality, became a lesson preserved far longer than the civilization itself. By the time Atlantis approached its final moments, daily life had become almost indistinguishable from permanence. The systems that governed the island continued to function. The rituals continued to be observed. The city remained active, ordered, and confident in its own endurance. There were no clear signs that the end was near. People still woke to familiar sounds, water moving through canals, footsteps along stone paths, voices calling across markets. Life continued to repeat itself day after day, reinforcing the belief that repetition itself was stability. This is how endings often arrive, not through chaos, but through normality. In this final phase of Atlantis, the people living there would not have experienced their world as fragile. They would have experienced it as complete. A civilization that had solved the problems of survival, organization, and order. A society that believed it understood itself. The sea still surrounded the island, but it no longer felt threatening. It was familiar, controlled, crossed daily by ships that came and went without incident. Water had become a resource, not a reminder. The land still produced food. Infrastructure still held. Authority still commanded trust. When small disruptions occurred, they were addressed through existing systems. A canal required repair. A shipment arrived late. A ritual was postponed. None of these events suggested collapse. They suggested maintenance. Maintenance had become the defining activity of Atlantean life. This focus on preservation shaped psychology as much as behavior. People thought in terms of continuity rather than change. The goal was not improvement, but consistency. Not transformation, but repetition. This mindset discourages reflection. Reflection asks whether systems still serve their purpose. Maintenance assumes that the purpose remains unchanged. As Atlantis settled deeper into this assumption, its ability to respond to the unexpected diminished. Flexibility had already been sacrificed for reliability. Adaptation had already been replaced by endurance. Daily life still felt purposeful. People believed in their roles. They trusted the structures around them. They assumed that the future would resemble the past, because it always had. The children of Atlantis grew up knowing only this version of the world. They did not remember earlier balance because they had never experienced it. To them, effort was normal. Obligation was expected. Order was virtue. Memory of restraint had become symbolic rather than practical. Religion still existed, but its role had changed again. Rituals continued, but they no longer questioned direction. They affirmed it. The divine was invoked as protection rather than guidance. This kind of belief reassures rather than warns. In such societies, danger rarely feels imminent. It feels theoretical, something that happens to others, not to oneself. Atlantis, in this reconstruction, does not collapse because its people were ignorant or foolish. It collapses because they trusted what had always worked. When the end finally comes, whether through natural catastrophe, environmental change, seismic activity, or some combination, the experience would have been sudden not because it occurred instantly, but because it arrived without psychological preparation. No amount of infrastructure can prepare a society for what it does not believe possible. The destruction of Atlantis, as preserved in Plato's account, is described as occurring in a single day and night. This compression is not meant to be geological accuracy. It is emotional truth. From the perspective of memory, collapse always feels sudden. What matters is not the mechanics of destruction, but the contrast. A world that felt permanent disappears. Systems that seemed invincible fail. Daily routines dissolve. For those who experienced it, there would have been no time to understand what was happening. Only time to react, to flee, or to be overwhelmed. For those who did not survive, Atlantis ended without explanation. For those who may have survived elsewhere, memory would have carried fragments. Fear of the sea, stories of lost land, warnings about excess. These fragments would be retold, reshaped, simplified. Over generations, details would fade. Meaning would remain. This is how Atlantis becomes memory rather than history. The world moved on. Other civilizations rose. New cities were built. Different systems replaced old ones. The physical island, if it existed, disappeared beneath water, sediment, and time. But the idea endured. Atlantis survived not because it was proven, but because it was remembered. Not because its ruins were found, but because its lesson was repeated. The lesson is quiet. Civilizations do not end when they fail to grow. They end when they forget why growth was once restrained. Life in Atlantis, as reconstructed here, was not extraordinary in its final moments. It was ordinary, predictable, familiar. That is what makes its disappearance unsettling. Atlantis reminds humanity that daily life can feel stable, right up until the moment it is not. That order can persist even as flexibility vanishes. That confidence can outlast wisdom. And that memory, once lost, is rarely recovered intact. Today, Atlantis remains beneath the surface, not only of the sea, but of history itself. It exists where certainty fades and reflection begins, not as a place to be found, but as a reminder to be understood. In remembering Atlantis, humanity is not searching for ruins. It is listening for warnings embedded in story. Warnings about balance, restraint, and the quiet cost of believing that tomorrow will always resemble today. And in that sense, Atlantis has never truly disappeared. It has simply become silent,